get going.
We're gonna die. He's going to kill us. We're gonna die.
Hi, and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm David Nakamura, a reporter here at the Post. And today we're continuing our Race in America series with our guest, the actor and author John Cho, whose new novel called Troublemaker is a portrait of a Korean American family set against the backdrop of the Los Angeles riots 30 years ago. John, welcome.
Thanks for having me. How are you?
I'm great. I have your book here, and I did read it over the weekend, and it's a powerful read. And I wanted to just jump right in with some questions about how this book came to be. You said in the author's note in the book that you had a contract to write a different kind of book in 2020, but that year conspired against fun, in your words. Tell us a little bit about how this particular story came to be, why you wanted to tell it, and why you used the backdrop of the LA riots to tell this story.
Uh, I will, and forgive me if this is a long answer, but I had a different book in mind. It was going to be much lighter. I'd always wanted to see an Asian American kid on the cover of a young adult novel. It was those years that I became a very avid reader, and perhaps because we were moving around so much, books meant so much more to me at that age than they do now, even. But but in 2020, because we were holed up with the pandemic, um, George Floyd was murdered, anti-Asian violence was rising, and our kids were at home with us. We were struggling to explain what could be happening, and it caused me to reflect on, I guess, really my immigrant journey and what the country meant, what I conceived the country to be when we arrived, and as I grew up, and what the country was today, and what my kids were going to inherit, and how we would explain all this stuff. So my thoughts drifted back to another incident of police brutality in 1992, and I wondered how a kid might see those events, and this story came to me, and we changed course.
You talked about that you moved around a lot. I think you ended up in Los Angeles. I'm wondering, you were a little bit older than Jordan, who's the protagonist of your novel, in 1992 during the aftermath of the Rodney King verdict. What do you recall from your perspective? I think you're around 19 years old, about that time.
A lot of anxiety. I was watching television like everyone else. At first, it was a phone call, the panicky phone call to my parents to see whether they were all right and whether we knew anyone that had been swept up in that situation. And the answer was thankfully no. But I think I've spent a lot of years trying to understand what that event meant for the Korean American community, and even myself in general. I think I was dealing with lots of things. I was worried. I was ashamed. I was trying to understand all of what I was feeling at the time. And I think, being a young person, I was 19 or 20 at the time. I didn't understand why those men would go on the rooftops and risk their lives and perhaps have to shoot back. Um, but being older now, I suppose I understand what that the building beneath them meant, which was their savings, their future, education, food on the table. It was sort of the entirety of their lives wrapped up in a single building.
Yes, what's interesting about the way you told the story was that the riots themselves, and even Los Angeles, is not the main point of the book. I think at its heart, the book is about an immigrant's family and their own personal journey in coming to the United States. There's a part of the book where you talk about Jordan's father, you're sort of ruminating on his decision to emigrate from South Korea, and saying maybe not the best decision given some of the struggles he was facing setting up in the United States. Can you talk about what you hoped readers take away from that passage in the book?
Well, I suppose in general, I wanted the focus of the book, even though it was set in a very volatile political situation, to be about a. I wanted it to be a portrait of a loving Korean American family, and I wanted to start there and build outward, and explore some family dynamics. And as far as that particular passage, I think. Um, I imagine that my parents must have questioned their decision making. It only seems natural. Even I, growing up and watching Korean television or movies, I would always imagine another life where we didn't come to America, and what would that have been like? So it is a kind of great fork in the road, the fork in the road for an immigrant family, and so it's difficult not to go back to that fork in the road when any difficulty happens in your life.
Absolutely. Another aspect of the book that I know you wrestled with, from what I've read, is the decision to make the sort of the narrative device Jordan's journey to try to bring a gun that his father owned but kept at home to his father at the liquor store the family owned. I'm curious about your decision to use the gun as sort of that narrative device, given that this book is aimed at sort of young adults. Can you talk about how you sort of wrestled with doing that, and why you came to the decision to go ahead and do that, and whether you had any thought of this book weighing in on sort of debate about guns and gun control?
Yeah, I guess the idea of the gun kind of originated from the image that most people remember from those days of Korean Americans, and it was the men on the rooftops with their rifles defending their stores. Incidentally, I think most people don't realize that those men weren't necessarily classical vigilantes, but um, any immigrant man from South Korea has served time in the military, so they are familiar with weapons in a way that a lot of Americans probably are not. But we wanted to start at that image and dig deeper and say, who is that man? What is his family life like? What is his home like? And so I always imagined that he owned a gun. Um, as far as the decision to um, put the gun into the narrative, I and have the child holding it, I indeed had some great reservations about it and wondering whether I should do it at all. But I also knew that um, my kids were going through active shooter drills at school. That that the discussion around guns is not something that I felt that I could avoid. And the way I phrased it, I think, in the author's note, was that I felt it was an abdication of our responsibility as parents to not talk about these difficult things with the kids, and give them an opportunity to ask questions about them. So that's where I started. But the gun for him um, is symbolic of so many things: manhood and adulthood, um, power. It's a stand-in for belonging in this country. So I just needed a device that would stand in for all of these feelings that he was having.
Sure. I wanted to talk a little bit about your personal journey, immigrating from South Korea as a young boy. I think you ended up first in Houston. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about some of the obstacles you may have faced fitting into the United States, whether it was language or other cultural aspects, in growing up as an immigrant here.
Yeah, I think it's my experience as an immigrant in Houston was probably very similar to a lot of Asian immigrants. There weren't many Koreans at the time in Houston. That would be the late 70s, early 80s. So a lot of people didn't know where Korea was on a map. Um, a lot of kids weren't aware that there was that American troops fought a war in Korea not too many years prior. So there's a lot of ignorance. A lot of it I understood. Some of it was mean. Some of it was just isolating. I think it was compounded by the fact that we were the only ones in our family that were in the United States. So, um, but yeah, like I say, that's a very that's a very commonplace experience for Asian Americans from my vantage point. I've heard that story many times.
It is. I wonder about your father because part of, I think it really at the center of your book is the relationship between Jordan and his father, and it makes basically a son's search for approval. And I wonder how much you took away from your own relationship with your father, who I think was a Christian pastor who ultimately originated from North Korea. But did you take some of the aspects, if not the exact details, from your relationship with him?
Yeah, it's funny. The book was written so impulsively in a lot of ways that kind of uh, right now as I'm talking about the book on the eve of its release, trying to understand what I put in there and why I wrote what I did. But absolutely, I think though Jordan and his father have this very compact um, journey of understanding one another in the book. Mine, it feels like a very compressed version of my relationship with my dad over many years. And incidentally, he recently finished the book and called me, and I said, "What did you think?" and he said, "I liked it. It's really made me think about." Um, what I did as a father, and our journey here, and I said, "You have to explain what that means. What do you mean?" And he said, "I'm not ready to talk with you about that yet." So I think he and I both are trying to figure out what our relationship as it relates to the book.
Sure. Hopefully, that book can help facilitate that conversation. You wrote we're in a time of this pandemic where there's been a lot of talk about backlash against Asian Americans and Asian people. You wrote in the Los Angeles Times in 2020 as anti-Asian hate incidents and racism was rising. Quote, I claim the citizenship my parents wanted for me, and I think I've spent my life earning it. I'm not going to let anyone or tell me or anyone who looks like me that we are not really American. Can you explain a little bit what you made you feel like you had to earn your citizenship?
Well, I think many immigrants have a very make a very conscious decision to embrace the values um, set forth in the Constitution. And I was one of those people. I heard those values. They were explicated to me in school and in society, and I think I made a very conscious choice to go forward and embrace it. And I think I've been a good citizen. And the process of even taking a citizenship test is kind of a compact version of that larger decision. And I think many Asian Americans feel the way I do, which is we pay our taxes, we've been here, and in the case of the '92 riots, we've spilt blood in this country. So um, I think we have as much of a stake to being American as anyone else, and it is a it is a tragedy that because of the way we look, we would be denied um, that citizenship.
Was there a moment you think you were maybe 6 years old when you came? Was there a moment you talk about taking a citizenship test? I don't know if there was there a moment you felt something had changed. You were American, or was that a gradual process?
I think that's a very gradual process. I mean, at first you feel American in contrast to your parents, who feel more Korean. And so I'd always felt more American, but I think it was the um, understanding American history that led me to believe that this was um, that even though we were an imperfect country, that we were set up to become more and more perfect as the decades passed, and that was really the kind of questioning that arc of progress was the start of this book, which is to say, I think I said as much in the LA Times op-ed that I imagined having the discussion about anti-Asian violence maybe with myself and my parents, or my parents having that discussion with me, but I never imagined that I would be having that discussion with my own children. That with each successive generation, things would become better, and I found myself reconsidering that proposition, that it felt like we were regressing as a country, and and that caused me to look backward toward the riots, and that's where the book started.
You mentioned your children, and I think in the op-ed you talked about having to both sort of call your parents after the outbreak of the coronavirus and some of the backlash against Asians, but also maybe having conversations with your children about what was happening and how they may be treated because of their race or their background. Can you talk more about those kind of conversations? What specifically maybe your kids experienced, and or your conversation about what you did tell them?
I don't have any magic advice for anyone, but I mean, our approach was to be as honest as we could without um, unnecessarily frightening them. That I didn't want them to feel,
No.
scared about walking on the street or anything, but we wanted to make them aware that this was happening and why. Um, and I think we just started a place of plain talk, and measure it. But that's our tact. I don't know whether we made the right decision, whether we did the right thing. Still remains to be seen. I think they're still working through it, and there's more violence. This is continued unabated. I'm very dismayed to hear about the things that are happening in New York in particular, and so this is an ongoing thing, you know.
Absolutely. I mean, it's been a year this month since the tragic mass shooting in Atlanta at the Asian-owned spas. Everyone from the White House to Congress to the Justice Department have taken steps to address anti-Asian hate and hate crimes. But there's outside groups that have said that Asian hate incidents against Asian Americans continue to be high. I'm curious, from your vantage point, do you think there is progress being made, either on the political level, through legislation, or even culturally, to try to deal with this?
I'm not aware of any successful legislation, are you? Um, so
Yes, there was the COVID hate crimes bill that Congress did pass. That it was modest, and it instructed the Justice Department to do a bit more on hate crimes. But you're right, there's no big sweeping kind of bill.
so I have to say, no. I guess that's my honest reaction. It doesn't seem nearly enough. And whatever I can only measure it in terms of the amount of violence that's happening, and I don't see any effective deterrent. Um, yeah, I guess I would have to sadly say no.
I've written about this. There's been talk about, sort of allyship among, minority groups, right? And but there's also been questions about tensions within those groups. So your book addresses some of this about the relationship between Korean Americans and African Americans, Hispanics. Jordan, in his journey through the arc of the novel, sort of experiences different kinds of people and sort of realizes there's maybe goodness in all of us. Last year, though, J. Caspian Kang, a Korean American writer, wrote an essay in the New York Times that also looked at the aftermath of the Los Angeles riots and talked about the tensions between Black and Korean communities that has existed for a while now, and talked about that if we are too simplistic and cannot really appreciate some of these challenges or some of the reasons for these tensions, it could, result in Korean American groups embracing, law and order conservatism. I'm curious about if you read that or if you have thoughts about this issue.
I didn't read it, but my general thoughts are that it's a very complicated issue, and allyship is absolutely useful. I do think that we have to recognize, um, first and foremost, that being Asian is a kind of, to some extent, it's an artificial construct. It's not a culture, like being Korean is a culture, but being Asian is not necessarily a culture. So we come from many different places, come from many different economic backgrounds. And I think the stereotype of Asians is that we're upwardly mobile, we earn a lot, and that's not necessarily the case. So we have to recognize how fractured we are as a political group, and how many different places we come from, and how varied we are. And I think the focus, rather than, I think I hear the phrase in the media a lot, race relations, as though the magic pill is us hugging one another. And I think really the focus should be on economic justice, social injustice, um, educational opportunities, and that's, I think, that's where our focus should be, rather than a kind of artificial détente uh, between races.
Sure. We're down to under 10 minutes here. I wanted to shift a little bit into representation, Asian American representation. You're in Hollywood, where it's very important. I was talking to Jeff Yang, whose son Hudson was, of course, the star of Fresh Off the Boat, about some of these issues for a story last year. He said, "Look, the backlash against Asians during this pandemic was a real wake-up call. Because Hollywood, Asians had been celebrating success, Fresh Off the Boat." Crazy Rich Asians, and that this moment, quickly showed that no matter who you are, it could turn on a dime. That stereotypes, negative stereotypes about Asians being untrustworthy and so on, could affect all of us. You've had experiences in Hollywood, and I've read some about them. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you've dealt with, efforts maybe in Hollywood to, pigeonhole you, stereotype you, or lack of support for projects featuring Asian American narratives and stories. How have you dealt with those?
Well, the easiest way to deal with stereotypical roles is the power that all actors have is to say no. Um, and that's something I've employed, even when I had no juice. When I was just starting out, I was so stupid. I said no to those roles. I just have always, I think I always wanted to please 12-year-old me, which may explain the existence of this book. But I always wondered whether 12-year-old me would appreciate me doing this role, or would be upset. And that's been kind of my very simple guiding principle. So that's the one thing you can do. Yeah, you have, there's certainly, gatekeepers still exist, and I don't know what the appetite is for telling our stories sometimes. I think um, as much new talent as there is right now, the one thing I want to be mindful of is, I want to tell our stories, but I want to also decide what our stories are as a community, rather than have someone else tell us what is an Asian story and what is not an Asian story. But yeah.
Yeah, I think I read that you had, maybe turned down the idea of having to do a sort of a stereotypical Asian accent in one case, maybe tweeted in another case, stop turning our roles sort of white. But I wanted on that note to talk. You wrote it in your essay last in 2020, about something you learned in traveling with Carl Penn, maybe almost 20 years ago now, in the aftermath of 9/11. He's South Asian. You were traveling in airports. Could you talk a little bit about that story and kind of what it showed you about how people are viewed in the United States?
Yeah, I can't remember what year that was. It must have been
I think
2005.
2004 is what. Yep.
2004, yeah. And we were traveling on these one-way tickets all around the country to do a promotional tour for Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle. And he was very reliably stopped for random searches for every flight we had. And obviously he's brown. And I wouldn't have believed it, I think, if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. And I think the capper was, we were traveling with a friend of his who's white, and he went through the security screening right ahead of Cal, and Cal was stopped and was frisked, and while we were waiting for him, his friend, his white friend, looked in his backpack and realized that he had neglected to remove the hunting knife that he brought camping. So the knife,
Double standard.
the giant Rambo knife went through, and he walked right on through. And Cal was stopped for having paper clips.
We have time for about just a couple more here. You know, you've written this book, which addresses a lot of these themes. You've dealt with it in Hollywood. I'm wondering about since the 2020 social justice protests, whether you've sensed, and it's not been that long, but whether you've sensed an appetite for more of these kind of stories. I do in the media, frankly, that there is somewhat, maybe not enough, of an appetite to tell some of these stories. Do you see that coming in Hollywood?
I think so. I don't know whether I can't say for sure. I'm not sure that I could have written this book prior. Uh, there seems to be a shift. I don't. I'm not out there as much to talking to people, but I think so. Just in the conversations that I've had in my world with my business partners and my representatives, it seems like there is an appetite to maybe explore and understand, for which I'm incredibly thankful, because it starts there. It starts with a shift in attitude and just the tiniest opening to try and understand one another. And so for me, I think the book is, if I had an aim, it would be to generate some empathy for a Korean American family, to understand our family dynamics, and to just sort of uh, peer into the household of a neighbor that you might know, actually.
Last question for you. You named the protagonist of Troublemaker Jordan, not after Michael Jordan, but after the river where Jesus was baptized and the Israelites crossed into the land of the Promised Land. At the end of the book, I don't want to sort of give away any spoilers, but you do talk about, sort of, we're all like rivers. We're running to something bigger, an ocean, something larger than ourselves. But sometimes I wonder, are we? And I wonder, given where we are a couple years after the social justice protests, where you see the country headed? Where are we running? And do you have some optimism about where we're headed?
I have some optimism. I think we have demonstrated an ability to unify and to behave according to our better angels. I think that's there within us. It's a very distressing political moment. It's tough. Sometimes it feels like the end of something. I'm referring to perhaps the environment and things that seemed 1,000 years away when I was a kid seem around the corner now. But I think we have it in us. Yes, I do. I maybe that's unfounded, but I think I'm holding on to what I referred to before, the ideals in America that I believed in. It's pretty deep in me, and I do love this country. There was talk, just because we were living in New Zealand when I was writing this book, and for a large part of the pandemic, we were having sort of these fanciful conversations. Could we live here? And we decided no. The United States is our home. We have family. We have roots here, and I want to stay and make this country one that that my children can inherit.
Very well said. Unfortunately, we're out of time. John, thank you so much for spending this time with us and for sharing some honest reflections here. And thank you for watching, and head over to WashingtonPost.com to register for future programs. Again, I'm David Nakamura, and thank you for joining Washington Post Live.